Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Brokamp, and welcome to Motley Fool Conversations. You know, your number one asset is your ability to earn an income. It determines the kind of lifestyle you can afford, types of benefits you receive, and the amount you can save for your future. Ideally, you're using those savings to invest in companies. And most of those companies, their biggest expense is their workforce. So understanding how companies choose and manage that workforce can be an important factor to analyze. Here to talk about human capital on both a personal and company level is Dr. Ben Zweig, the CEO of Revelio Labs and the author of a new book, Job Architecture, Building a Language for Workforce Intelligence. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the story of how you went from getting a PhD in economics to working for IBM to founding Revelio Labs.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. Started in economics, love economics. I just, think it's interesting and valuable. And I love teaching economics as well. So I still teach a little bit. I teach the future of work at NYU. But during graduate school, while I was pursuing that, I worked at a hedge fund. It was an emerging markets hedge fund, and it was a very interesting experience in a few ways. One, just it was fun being a quant and seeing life in hedge fund world. But what I found most interesting was how sophisticated people were in that industry. Everyone had their day job, whether it was research or trading or whatever it was. And that was kind of right in front of them. And then right next to them, they had their Bloomberg terminal. And that just represented all the information they could possibly have just at their fingertips. And everyone had it. Everyone knew that what they were looking at was exactly the same as what, the team down the street was looking at. It was completely ubiquitous. But then left to the corporate world, really for two reasons. I mean, one is that I realized I did not have the stomach to be working at a hedge fund. Every time I'd see my portfolio go up and down, I'd wake up in a cold sweat. So, you need to kind of be zen to be in that space. And I am not zen. And then I also thought, I'm an economist. I should see how goods and services get made in the real world, in the real economy. And then went to IBM, and it was super exciting because I ended up running this team called the Workforce Analytics team, which was about how to help IBM manage their own workforce. And that was, 3/4 of expenses at IBM were employee salaries. And, that's pretty similar to what it is in the entire market. And what shocked me the most was how unsophisticated that analysis was. Companies really don't have a good sense of how they're managing their own employees, which, is their biggest expense. And also just matters a lot to what gets produced and how they get produced and how efficiently they get produced. So that was really unsophisticated. And so I started Revelio Labs really for the purpose of bringing that sophistication that exists in financial markets and trying to bring that to labor markets. So that's kind of the mission behind Revelio Labs. And, I'm sure we'll talk about this. This is what job architecture is all about. It's that the core of the core of the ability to analyze human capital, to analyze employment, is to have standardized categories. So, we really need to be able to compare what's happening at one company to what's happening at another company. So that's all possible with financial information. We have financial statements that are put together by armies of accountants, and we don't have that for companies. Companies don't report what's happening to their employees, and there is no standard way to categorize employees. So what I'm trying to propose is that employee information can be standardized and should be standardized, and that will ultimately be the linchpin of making comparisons across companies possible. And there's a lot of potential once that can be done. So that was a lot. I'll pause there.
Well, since you are an economist, you did have a few economic lessons in the book. And you start with the basics of that the economy is driven by two things, capital and labor. And as you just suggested, right, starting way back in the 1700s when a bunch of guys met on 68 Wall Street underneath the Buttonwood tree, which eventually became the New York Stock Exchange, we just had this development where the capital market is very efficient, lots of information, the 10Ks, 10Qs, Bloomberg terminals, if you have the $25,000 a year to pay for them.
Yeah.
But the labor market hasn't had that. Why hasn't it had it? I know you're trying to do that now, but why is it taking so long?
Yeah, it's okay. So I think there are good reasons and bad reasons. good reasons are that labor markets are quite a bit more complicated than financial markets. Really, I think for a few reasons, but one is that they are two-sided markets. So what I mean by that is that, in a one-sided market, like let's say you go to the grocery store and you want to pick out an apple to eat. You pick the apple. The apple does not have to choose you. The apple doesn't have to pick you. And that's true in capital markets as well. You want to buy a piece of equipment, you choose it, you buy it. In labor markets, it's not that way. You want to employ someone, you don't just get to choose that person also has to choose you. Same in other two-sided markets like education, dating, kidney exchange, any sort of there are a lot of markets that exist where you choose the good has to choose you. And then that represents some difficulty in just how search and match happens. So there's complexity in those markets, and that's, I think, the good reason why these markets are more complicated. The bad reason is just that I think we have, in previous generations, in the 1800s, the U.S. economy was primarily driven by innovations in capital. We were driven by the railroads and really very like capital intensive industries. And to evaluate companies, you really had to understand their investments in capital and equipment. And the employees were more or less widgets. Employees were kind of replaceable, and it was just a cog in an assembly line. And that really has started to change in the post-war period. And with the advent of knowledge work, and now we are in the information age, and there's a lot of and now the companies that are the most successful companies, the titans of industries today, they get their value primarily from their employees. So if you think about Amazon, Netflix, Apple, Google, these are companies where the source of their value is really in their engineers, in their code, and that is not tangible. So we live in a more intangible economy today, that's primarily driven by human capital, by labor. So I think that I think the reason why I say that's a bad reason is because the accounting profession just hasn't caught up. So the field of accounting is still kind of living in the age of railroads, and hasn't adapted to the intangible age of human capital, I'd argue. So I mentioned before that there are millions and millions of people whose job it is to categorize financial capital, and those are accountants. We live next door to them. We know them. This is a profession that we all understand that it exists, but I think we don't think a lot about why it exists. And the reason why we have these millions of accountants is so that anyone can look at a company, can look at financial statements, and understand important aspects of that company. How much did they pay for this? How much earnings did they get from that? What do they owe in taxes? All this information is really in service of understanding companies, but we don't understand companies through the lens of their most important factor of production, which is people. Another thing I want to propose in the book is that we don't actually need millions of people to categorize employment. And that's really because we can leapfrog the discipline of accounting, because we have, today we have large language models. So that has, large language models are good at a lot of things. One thing they're especially good at is categorization. So ultimately we want to know, what's similar, who does similar types of work, and we want to categorize employees between organizations. So one way to do that, I think the best way to do that, is to categorize people based on what they do. So we can say, if employees at two different companies have the same bundle of work, they have the same job. It doesn't really matter what they're called. You could be called a project manager in one company, a client success engineer in another company, but if you have the same bundle of tasks, the set of work activities, you have the same job, just kind of definitionally. If we want to think about jobs as bundles of tasks, which is sort of the traditional way that economists define, like, what is a job? And then once we're able to do that, then we really can, identify how many people are doing this job at company A, how many people are doing this job at company B, and compare the compositions, compare the trends across these companies, and that is very powerful. And what large language models introduce is the ability to actually analyze the content of jobs. So we get a lot of data on the work activities of certain jobs in companies. Those can come from bullet points on resumes. So you can think of that as the supply side of labor markets. People say what they do. They list out, what did you do in this job? And there's tons and tons. I mean, there's a billion or so public online profiles out there, and we can get these bullet points. And that's a huge corpus of text about what people do in their jobs. An even bigger corpus of text out there is that on job postings. We can think of that as representing the demand side of labor markets. When companies list a job, there's a set of sections that they list out, and one section is the responsibilities. What are people expected to do in this job? And that's another big set of text where we can identify, like, what are the work activities involved in this job. So we get tons and tons of text, and then from that we can develop a taxonomy of work activities, of what people do. And once you have a good understanding of work activities, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to develop a taxonomy of jobs, because jobs are really just collections of activities. Another benefit is that it's then also very easy to develop a taxonomy of skills, which are attributes of the workforce, attributes of people, because skills really are just inputs into completing those work activities. So it really rests on understanding, what are these work activities, what are people doing, and from that you can develop a good structured understanding of all the different components of the labor market.
You can see how this is valuable for employers. You can certainly see how it could be valuable for the government to see what's going on in the labor force. We at the Motley Fool are investors, so let's talk a little bit about that part. And if you don't mind, let's start with an example from your book in terms of how you were analyzing what was going on at Meta and anticipating how they were going to change their strategy.
Yeah, that was a wild story. So we had done this analysis with a journalist at Bloomberg. His name is Matt Boyle. He runs the column called Work Shift. It's about the future of work. And we, together with this journalist, we had discovered that right after Facebook had done the rebrand to Meta, they had been hiring all these people that were skilled in VR and AR, all these kind of metaverse types of people, people that were skilled in metaverse technologies. And what we had seen in this collaboration with Bloomberg was a reversal of that. So at Meta, they had basically stopped hiring people with VR and AR skills, like immediately. They just completely dropped off. And we saw this and we were like, wow, this is a huge reversal of their strategy. It's a big deal. So we wrote an article about it. And then we heard from the Meta Talent Intelligence team and their public relations team, and they had said, hey, we didn't. This is not coming from us. Like, we didn't announce this. We are going to contest these findings. So we said, oh my God, okay, maybe this is wrong in some way. Let's check it out. What are the keywords that you're using? Maybe let's try to align so that our trends look the same. And, we had worked with them for a little while and basically got the same trend. And we thought, this is a real thing. And, the ability to basically categorize these things into skills and activities can uncover a very large business shift. And it turned out the same way. So we said, hey, we are sticking with it. That's journalistic integrity. We're not to back off. And we didn't back off. And a week later, they had made a public announcement that they were retreating from their VR strategy. So, we got vindicated, but it was pretty scary at the time. So I don't know if you realize how intimidating you are in the media, but we felt it.
I'm not personally, but I could see how that would be a little scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great example. And on the one hand, like it's so obvious, right? Most companies do spend most of their money on their workforce. Like you, of course, should be looking at what's going on, but it's difficult. You point out in the book that there are 4 key pieces of data that people should look at: employee profiles, job postings, employee perception, and salary benchmarks. And I don't know if you want to talk about each of those or just them in general in terms of what they can tell you about a company.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I think of those 4 segments is really just because that's the data that's available. So it's not that these are the comprehensive set of information that we'd like. I mean, ideally, I'd love to get data on employee performance, but performance ratings are just not out there. So that's just a non-starter. So this collection of data is really based on what exists and what's feasible to collect. But with that, you can identify like a really good set of what's happening at a company that you have no affiliation to. And for investors, investors are in the business of understanding companies that they don't have an affiliation to. So we can't really be looking at internal HR data, although that's got things like employee performance that would be nice to have. But yeah, the most powerful source of information is online profiles. So that can tell you start dates, end dates, where you get the full workforce dynamics of a company. You can see how many people they have, how many people are coming in a given time period, how many people are leaving in a given time period. So the full stocks and flows of employees, and how that breaks down by various employee characteristics, by occupation, geography, skill, seniority. So then with that, you can see, what is the attrition rate, let's say, of some key role. And let's say, a bunch of salespeople are quitting at SAP. Maybe you want to short their stock. Maybe they're not going to hit their targets next quarter. So that's a really good indication of, who's coming, who's leaving. So that really comes from profiles. From postings, you get a forward-looking proxy for expected hires. Of course, you get the actual hires from the inflows, but you get a good proxy. If a company has a hiring freeze, or if they're hiring for a certain key role, that Meta example was really from postings. We can see, what do they want? How is their demand trending for a certain key role, key skill, something like that. Employee perception, I think, is kind of the most underrated one. And there you can see like what people are writing about how they feel about a company. And employees know a great deal about what's happening inside a company. So if you see that business outlook is trending up or trending down, that tells you something about, what is the inside scoop of what's happening at this company? How do people feel about, an upcoming merger, or a new return to office policy or something like that? You get the real inside view. And then I think it's important to list out pay as distinct from all of those, because this is, we can get data from how much people make from a variety of sources. And now with pay transparency, with new legislation around pay transparency, that's so much more out there. And prices contain so much information about, the relative demand, the relative bargaining power between workers and firms, and just, how those are being, shifted from one role to another, what it implies about retention. So there's so much information about how much people make and what that tells you about a company's strategy. So I think that's tremendously powerful. There are also more tertiary data sets out there. There's layoff notices, there's immigration filings, there's freelance platform data. There's a lot out there, but I'd say those 4 are really the biggest to pay attention to.
Let's move on to how this information can help workers. You wrote in the book, finding a good employer is like finding a spouse. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to kiss a lot of frogs. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you definitely do. I mean, I think, just to belabor that analogy to a point of usefulness, perhaps. If you live in a very small town. I mean, I think there was some data on this that shows kind of the generational split of where people found their spouses, and found that in our sort of great grandparents era, something like 30% of people like from I'm butchering this metric, but it was in it was in Aziz Ansari's book Modern Romance, which is excellent, but documents that like some extremely high share of marriages were people that met in their own building, and then extending outside of that was like in their very narrow neighborhood, and now of course people find partners from all over, so it's a much more distributed market than it's been back when people lived in small villages. And of course, buildings are only relevant to large urban centers. But I think the point I want to make here is that a lot of people in labor markets, candidates, job seekers, have a sense of what are the contending occupations from a very, very narrow from a very narrow viewpoint. So when people go out to the market and start looking for a job, maybe after high school or after college, they don't know the occupations that even exist out there. I mean, I think a lot about occupations, and I still discover new occupations that I didn't know existed. But if you are from a rural area, there's a very small chance that you've ever heard of like what a DevOps manager does. These are things that are obscure even as you get deeper and deeper into it. And what ends up happening is that workers select into occupations based on what their parents do, what their relatives do, what their friends' parents do, what their parents' friends do. This is just like what they see. And that could be extremely narrow. So their sense of what's out there is very, very limited. I mean, if you take it even further, I have a 4-year-old daughter, and if you ask her what she wants to be, there are only a few jobs that she's heard of, and it's like ballerina or zookeeper or astronaut. These are a very small share of the global labor market, to say the least. So and that expands as we grow, but not that much. So I think what's really required is a lot more visibility, a good source of information about what are the occupations that are out there, and details about those occupations. How much money do people make? How long do they stay here? What kind of options does it open up when you exit? How do people like? What's the work-life balance like? What are the other types of workers that you'll work with? Is it social? These are things that people can get a sense of that would be very valuable right up front in their job search.
I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but obviously people are looking for jobs based on what they see on whatever, LinkedIn, Indeed, or whatever. Yeah. Given your experience and your analysis, if you were to look at a job description, how much would you say like that? Yep, that's 100% accurate. Or do you feel like, that probably generally most people end up doing only 70% of what they thought they were doing when they got that job?
Yeah, this is a huge question. So I think this is one of the most important questions in the age of AI. So I'll get to why I think that's such a critical point. But just to kind of validate your presumption, when you enter a job, there's some set of information about what you're expected to do. So these are the responsibilities. Then you start, and that, first of all, that may have been wrong from the beginning. This may have been written by someone who just doesn't really know, or has a very vague sense of what they want people to do. Or maybe, as a candidate, you are good at some parts of it and maybe bad at other parts of it, and they decide, let's kind of, reconfigure this job to match the profile of the candidate. That happens all the time as well. But I think what's what's changing the most rapidly is the extent to which jobs actually transform after you start. So, let's say it was well written and it was purposeful, but then you start and a few things change. One is that the demands on the business change. So, for me, in my firm, we have, I don't know, 70 people or so. We're a relatively small company, and the demands on the business change every day. Every day there's a new client request, and they say, "Hey, can you guys do this new thing?" And we say, "Well, for the right price, we'll make it happen," and then figure out who to staff on this. And then we go around and say, "Hey, who's got the bandwidth, the skills? Who do we trust? If it's high stakes or low stakes?" And then we figure out who should do what. So we are kind of reconfiguring the what people do based on the changing demands of the business. There's also changes on the labor supply side of it. Maybe someone quits, and when someone quits, we have to figure out who can take over their workload, who can maintain whatever they were maintaining, who can work on the projects that they were working on. Or maybe we find out that someone we hired is just extraordinary and they can, they've automated something or they've taken on some new work or something like that. Or maybe, someone starts doing something and they say, "Hey, I actually really don't like this work. I'd rather be working on something different. Can I move teams? Can I move projects? Or I don't like working with this person," or whatever it is. But these things change all the time because of changing demands of the business, changing composition of the employees that you have. And one point I make in the book is that it's really the role of managers to be the liaison between the needs of the business and what the workers can provide. And that is management in a nutshell. Management standing on one foot is job reconfiguration. And now with AI, any automated technology, is one thing to say about AI is that, or really any technology, is that it does not automate jobs wholesale. It automates components of jobs. It automates tasks. And then what firms need to do and workers need to do is reconfigure their workload to adapt to some parts of that workload being automated. So that's something that has increased the need to reconfigure the work activities in the job. And one argument that I make in the book is that this reconfiguration is trackable. We should be able to see what people do, today, what people do a year from today, and how that changes, how that transforms. We have all this information about what people do, and being able to track that leads us to be able to manage it.
So you touched on AI. Of course, we have to bring it up, and there's concerns about whether AI is going to take my job. You make the point in the book, and you said it here, touched on it, that AI will take away tasks, but in the end, a job is sort of a coordination of tasks. And in the end, it's going to be very difficult to automate that need for a conductor.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the definition of a job as a bundle of tasks is mostly right, with the caveat that as a worker, you're not just executing tasks, you are also coordinating tasks. You are also playing the role of an orchestrator, where you are deciding, what do I do first? What do I do second? What depends on what? Who do I need to work with? So you are deciding on a sequence of connected tasks, and you are the decision maker there. Of course, AI, the promise of agentic AI is that AI can do some form of coordination, that it can do a workflow, which is actually a sequence of tasks. So for those of you who have played around with deep research, that is technically a sequence of tasks, not a single task. But even so, that becomes a work process that someone needs to coordinate with other work processes and other people doing work processes. So that coordination still needs to happen. And hopefully we can do more higher order coordination, which there's more economic value for, and make more money and have higher returns to that, which is all great. In terms of AI, displacing labor, I think there's a few dimensions of that I think are worth paying attention to. One is how responsive are firms to AI? So do companies actually adopt AI quickly, or does it take them a while? If they adopt AI very quickly, then that's more, then that can lead to more displacement. If it takes them a while, then we have less to worry about. There's more time to absorb this. So that's one factor. How responsive are firms? Another is how responsive are workers. There's always going to be a set of jobs and work activities and roles that are less vulnerable to automation, and some that are more. So the question is, how quickly can workers, select into new occupations? How quickly can they retrain themselves, reskill themselves toward things that are less vulnerable to automation? If they can do that quickly, great. We have nothing to worry about. If it takes them a very long time, if someone just chooses a job, a very narrow job, and then they're stuck there for the rest of their life, then we have a lot to be worried about. And the third most important factor, I would say, is how quickly can jobs reconfigure. So when you go into a job, you have this set of tasks, and can that job transform into a new set of tasks that are higher priority, that are less susceptible to automation? That's where I get concerned about some types of work that have kind of externally imposed rigidities. So there are some types of occupations that have very strict licensing requirements, that are very strict occupational licensing, and that impedes our ability to reconfigure work. So if you are a physician's assistant or a phlebotomist or something, that is, you have signed on to do a set of tasks, and that cannot be easily configured. But if you are a journalist or a consultant or an economist, you do whatever you need to do, and your job probably transforms all the time. And that's just a very fluid process.
This whole story of technology changing careers, changing jobs is nothing new. You use plenty of examples in the book how, one of the biggest employers, if not the biggest employer in America in the early 1900s was AT&T, and that was because no one had phone numbers. You just called up the switchboard operator, and they plugged all these wires, which, by the way, was a miserable job. I looked it up on YouTube, what they had to do, no fun. But the bank tellers would give you cash, but then ATMs came along. Your mom was a trained typist, but then we didn't need typists anymore. Yeah. So one of the lessons really is everyone needs to be working on some sort of a plan B or a plan C, because this has always happened, and it probably will always happen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the example of switchboard operators and typists are really examples where labor supply was very responsive. So, you had, at the time, you had a lot of young women in these roles that were trained specifically on operating a switchboard or, typing documents. And those workers had adapted very, very quickly. So when those jobs became obsolete, they were able to find new jobs very quickly. There was really basically no technological unemployment that resulted from that displacement. So I think that should make us optimistic about workers' ability to find new jobs, step into new things, and that was they largely moved into administrative work, sort of secretarial occupations, and in the case of my own mom, she started as a typist and basically went into an administrative position, and then started basically categorizing where kind of the corporate structure of companies, and that basically became this like paralegal. And I think that paralegal work is actually very closely to what we would think of as almost like a database administrator right now. It's someone who really, owned the information related to, what company owns what other company. It was just information that was held by someone and managed by someone. So we don't think of, database administration and typing as related, but there was a path there. And it was more common than I think we think. The example of bank tellers, I think, is a little different in my mind, because these weren't actually, this was actually more about occupational reconfiguration than about workers needing to find new jobs. So, when the ATM came out, the thought was, there was this article, I forget exactly where it was published, but the idea was, there's this new technology, the ATM, and the job of bank tellers will be totally demolished, and there will be no bank tellers. And that didn't happen. Actually, the number of bank tellers today is like many times more than the number of bank tellers there were pre-ATM. And there's a few theories about how this happened, but I think the best understanding of what really happened is that what we call a bank teller today is actually not the same set of activities as what we had called a bank teller back then. Now it's really more like a client success manager. If you step into a bank and meet with a bank teller, they're gonna pitch you on new products and really like try to figure out what is the best set of tools that you should be using. What's the best credit card for you? And do you need a line of credit? Should you have some account that like accounts for foreign exchange stuff or whatever? They get into the needs of the customer. They are not simply withdrawing and depositing cash. So I think it's actually just a different job, but it's the same people who worked as bank tellers, learning those new skills, doing those different sets of activities. And it's kind of a coincidence that we decided that whoever was making decisions at the time had decided to continue to call it a bank teller. It could have easily happened that whoever was running Chase Manhattan at the time could have called this a banking service representative, and then the story would have been very different. We would have said, oh, all the bank tellers had disappeared, and we have this new occupation. So there's a little bit of obscurity in what really happened with bank tellers.
That really gets to your point of how you need to have the right taxonomy and classification to really accurately describe what's going on. We just have a few minutes left. I want to have close here with a final question. As you mentioned, you're a father and a professor. So do you have an opinion on what parents should be doing to prepare their kids for the workforce that they may enter, especially in terms of AI? But like I said, technology has always been changing the workforce.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for my kids are really young, so my advice there is just survive, But but as they get older, I mean, I think about this a lot as somebody who really more with my professor hat on. What do I tell young people? I think there's a few thoughts. One is that coordination really is a skill. And I think about, a lot of family examples, but when my dad was doing an MBA in the 60s, the MBA was really a path to management. People who finished an MBA in the 60s moved on to run a division of something, and that was the path. Now, that's not the case. People finish an MBA and they become a kind of level 2 analyst. Where their role is really about executing work. And I think the education of management as a discipline has really eroded. Management is not really a vibrant academic field in the way that it used to be. And I think that's because the return on learning how to coordinate has really diminished as more jobs have become more about executing tasks and implementing things. So even 10 years ago when I started teaching at NYU, the class I was teaching was data science for MBAs. It was really like how to learn Python. And I still think it's valuable. I still think everyone should learn how to use Python. But there was a shift from business schools at the time. And, I taught a similar program at Columbia Business School. So really the top business schools were really prioritizing vocational skills. And I think there should be a reversal in that. And I would recommend that young people start to do more end-to-end projects. Just make a product, create something from beginning to end, because when you try to create something, and be like a little micro entrepreneur, you'll find that there's a lot of finagling to do to just get things to functionally work together. So coordinating between independent work processes, I think, is a skill that can be learned. And I encourage young people to do that. Another is really touching on what we'd spoken about earlier about just knowing what's out there, just researching what are the occupations out there, and continuing to check in on this. What are the emerging roles? What's becoming more obsolete? How has culture changed in investment banking versus consulting or something? How is technology affecting certain jobs? So I think just keeping tabs on the occupational landscape is really important. And then another piece of advice that I think is a little bit more evergreen is that there's pretty high returns to just being a functional professional, just knowing how to set up meetings, just being on time, answering emails quickly. That is kind of in short supply, which is I think just being responsive, just having good work habits is also something that can be learned. Those are my recommendations. I'm sure there are more, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, Ben, and I really enjoyed the book. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.